PM Modi calls for G20 membership for African. See, why would Prime Minister or India would ask for G20 countries to include African Union as a member? One of the important thing that if we want to understand this, we have to go back to 2018. When Prime Minister visited African continent and in Ugandan Parliament, he delivered 10 guiding principles. 10 guiding principles. The two important takeaway from those guiding principles was number one, that development assistance that India is going to give to the African countries will be based on their priority. That means it will be on priority and the needs of African countries, and it will not be driven by the top-down approach. Second important thing in this context of this article, was that he called for making global order. He called for making global order which is just, fair and democratic. Now, what do we mean by this? If we see, there is only one country from the entire African continent in the grouping, that is South Africa. That means G20 nations, only one African country is there inside G20. Whereas if we see the European countries, 5 countries are there in G20 apart from European Union. So they are overrepresented in G20. And Africa is underrepresented in G20. Decisions taken inside G20 has wider implication across the globe. It will not only impact the socio-political and economic life of the European countries and the member country, but it will also impact the life of other non-members country. Therefore, to make the process inclusive, fair, just and democratic, it is very essential that we also include African Union as part of it. So it is directly driven out of the guiding principles that Indian Prime Minister delivered before the Ugandan Parliament. So this is the context that will set the introduction to this article. Okay. So by proposing African Union for G20 membership, India has pitched itself as a leader of developing and underdeveloped countries. So it is also one of the means for India to project its soft power, to appeal to our historical legacy, where we have been leading the South, the global South countries, and therefore it was an important and strategic move for India. Now there are 6 reasons in African Union that will come slightly later on, but first of all we have to understand an important thing. See, if we see today's global economic order, we will find that it is heavily or asymmetrically skewed in favor of Western countries, and it is unfavorably suitable for the developing countries, especially African countries. So let us look at something called special drawing rights in IMF. Okay, so it is equivalent to 650 billion US dollars. Okay, 650 billion US dollars are available or are distributed among all the countries of the members of IMF. Okay, out of this, Africa's share is just 5%. So African share out of this $650 billion of special drawing rights that they have right to avail is just 5%. So they are asymmetrically disadvantaged in the entire economic global order as well. So this is one example that will set the context as to why India was pitching for the G20 membership of the African Union and how India can help make the world order democratic. Another important thing that we have to understand here is that African Union has more than 50 members, and if India wants to be there as a permanent member in United Nations Security Council, their votes is very, very important. Okay, and many of the countries in Africa are not yet on board as to the India's permanent membership with the veto power. Okay, so this is also one of the strategic reason as to why would India push for African membership. Okay, so AU is an intergovernmental organization. This is about African Union that we are discussing right now. It consists of 54 member states that make up countries of African continent, and basically it is a continental unit with a wide range of goals aimed at strengthening its member states both individually and collectively. Now, African Union is about bringing in more political and economic integration of the region. Now, recently, African Continental Free Trade Area has been signed. Now, this area will basically boost the bargaining power of African Union vis-a-vis rest of the world, because individually these weaker countries are powerless, whereas collectively they can boost their overall bargaining power with respect to the rest of the world, so that they will themselves be able to make this world more just and fair as well as democratic for themselves, right? So this states both individually as well as collectively. Okay, apart from this, it will boost intra-regional, intra-African Union trade and investment ties also, so that the overall economic well-being, poverty reduction, sustainable development, etc. can be carried out throughout the African Union. So this is some important ideas. Now, AU's headquarter, again it can be an important prelims information, is inside Addis Ababa, capital of Ethiopia. Now, purpose of AU, as I had already discussed with you some important things. It wants a integrated, prosperous, peaceful Africa driven out of its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in global arena. So obviously integrated means political as well as economic integration, and prosperity obviously to fight the poverty, etc. Peaceful is very important here, because there have been a lot of violence throughout the history in Africa. Some violence were driven by the ethnic conflicts. Some violence were driven by the dictatorship that was imposed upon the people of African continent. We have seen the Rwanda violence, how many people were killed, millions were killed in the violence. Now, so we have to understand that African continent has never been that peaceful, and it was also the important reason why African Union was created. There have been boundary disputes among several countries, dispute regarding river water sharing in the many countries. So all these issues have been creating conflict. So therefore this African Union was envisaged where it can selectively intervene to make sure that violence does not happen, the war does not happen, and therefore it also has built its own peacekeeping forces. Okay, so this is the meaning of peaceful Africa and the context in which we have to see. Agenda 2063's aspirations include a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Okay, so sustainable development is very important to understand here. If you want to build prosperity, a prosperous Africa that is based on inclusive growth, that means the benefits of the growth must be distributed fairly among all its people. It will help bring people out of poverty. So inclusive growth. But it has to be backed by sustainable development. What is the meaning of it? That if we have been able to bring millions out of poverty, and next year we are faced with some pandemic, we are faced with some extreme events such as droughts and floods, what will happen? The millions that have been brought out of poverty within 1 year will come back to the same poverty cycle. So that means that growth and development is not sustainable. Okay, so this is the rationale behind it. An integrated continent, politically united based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism. Obviously, it has a great utility for African people because they will be able to project before the world themselves as a united force. So they will be able to extract a heavy bargaining out of the world developed countries, and they will be able to extract benefits which they will not be able to do it by being divided and fighting among each other, because fighting among each other will only allow external forces to intervene and take and exploit the situation for their advantage. Okay. As Africa is lacking good governance, because the regimes are not sustainable, the institutions of the states have not penetrated, they do not have the depth, and therefore the governance is something that is lacking. And obviously rule of law is an important thing for you are looking for democracy outside, but you first have to be democratic inside also. And rule of law is a very important component for any democracy. And when it comes to rule of law, we have to understand it is also the idea of equality before law. That means there is no arbitrary action. Everybody is equal before the eyes of the law. Okay. Now, rule of law also essentially means that law must also be just, fair and reasonable. It cannot be that there is a rule of law, but law itself is unjust. It is discriminatory law. It discriminates against various ethnicities. So when this kind of rule of law is there, then it cannot be called a rule of law, but it has to be called rule by law. Okay. So in this kind of situation, it is very difficult to create peace, because this kind of situation where the rule is not just fair, then various ethnicities will feel marginalized, various ethnicities will develop grievances, and therefore there will be conflict. So establishment of rule of law has to be the core of the principle of African Union if it genuinely wants to establish peace alongside the protection of human rights and justice among its citizens. Okay. Now, to achieve the goal set by the Agenda 2063, AU is setting itself as a series of 5 10-year plans, with the first plan running from 2014 to 2023. Okay. So they are adopting the 10-year plans. Now, role of African Union in promoting peace in the continent. So first of all, they've set up something called Peace and Security Council in 2004, and the council has right to or responsibility to intervene. Now, what is the important difference here? We have to understand that it replaced the principle of non-interference with the one of non-indifference. Okay. So principle of non-interference is an important principle in Westphalian nation-state system. We have signed a Panchsheel agreement with China. We have also offered some doctrine in the form of Gujarat doctrine, etc. So we have always emphasized that we will not interfere in each other's internal affairs, because we recognize each other as a sovereign state. So the modern Westphalian nation states, it is the cardinal principle of non-interference. But when you are coming up with an African Union, you are forming a union and you are also aspiring for political integration, that there has to be some trade-off of sovereignty in the interest of establishing peace. Therefore, it has been replaced by the principle of non-indifference. Okay, so if there is problem, then it cannot be shown indifference. There has to be some intervention. Okay, the council can deploy military forces in situations which include genocide and crimes against humanity, as happened during Rwanda, which was a great failure of Organization for African Unity, which is the precursor organization of African Union. So AU oversees the new Partnership for Africa Development, NEPAD, which is otherwise called. It is an anti-poverty blueprint which offers to bargaining with the West the promotion of good political and economic practices in return for more aid and investment. So African Union has regularly suspended member states over coup and readmitting them when the constitutional rule prevent. So whenever, in order to promote democracy and rule of law, one has to discourage coup attempts, right? So whenever there was a coup in any of the African Union countries, they have always suspended those countries and only readmit them when they were able to successfully establish the constitutional rule.